What if I told you the Wright brothers weren't the first to dream of flying? Not even close. For centuries, visionaries chased the skies. Some with sketches that never left the page, others who risked their lives in fragile gliders, and a few who came shockingly close to powered flight before the Wright brothers. Every attempt, whether a crash or a glide, pushed humanity closer to the breakthrough of 1903 at Kitty Hawk. That moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of countless failures, experiments, and wild ideas. Stick with me until the very end because I'll have an extra story for you. One about a Brazilian pioneer who didn't just fly, he turned aviation into a spectacle. Imagine floating above crowded city streets while thousands watched in awe. That's how bold he was. So today, we're diving into 3 stories that paved the way for the Wright brothers. And one final tale that shows just how global the race for the skies really was. When you hear the name Leonardo da Vinci, you probably think of art. The Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, or the Vitruvian Man. But Leonardo's notebooks tell a very different story. Tucked between anatomical sketches and designs for war machines are drawings of contraptions meant to soar through the air, centuries before airplanes were even imaginable. These weren't just drawings on a napkin either. Leonardo filled over 13,000 pages across dozens of notebooks, much of it written in his famous mirror script, where the text reads from right to left. Inside these pages, we find some of the earliest serious attempts to analyze the mechanics of flight. One of the most important of these is the Codex on the Flight of Birds. In this slim collection of notes, Leonardo dissected the movements of birds and theorized how their wings worked. He wrote,
"A bird is an instrument working according to mathematical law, which instrument it is within the capacity of man to reproduce with all of its motions, but not with a corresponding degree of strength."
That single sentence captures the attention of his time. You see, humans had the intelligence to design the wings, but not yet the technology to power them. Leonardo was captivated by how birds interacted with the air. He carefully studied how kites and storks angled their wings, how they rode thermals, and how feathers overlapped to catch wind. He even dissected birds to study their musculature. That one's a little weird. He wasn't just marveling at nature, he was reverse engineering it. To him, the sky wasn't the realm of the divine. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved. One of his most famous designs was the ornithopter, a giant bat-like set of wings powered by pedals, gears, and pulleys. And no, not the crazy helicopter things from the Dune series. Leonardo's version looked less like a sci-fi masterpiece and more like a Renaissance gym machine designed to fling you into the nearest ditch. In theory, a pilot could flap just like a bird. In reality, the human body simply didn't have the power to weight ratio to make it work, and the materials of his day were far too heavy. He didn't stop there though. In his notebooks, Leonardo also sketched what he called the air screw, a spiral motor meant to be spun by men at the base. And it weirdly looks like a helicopter rotor. Except his version was made out of linen and wood. Without lightweight frames or an engine, it never left the ground. But the principle was there. Lift generated by rotary motion. He also even drew parachute designs. One note reads,
"If a man has a tent made of linen of which the apertures have all been stopped up, and it be 23 feet across, he will be able to throw himself down any great height without suffering injury."
It's almost exactly what modern parachutes look like today. And here's what makes all this eerie. Leonardo wasn't simply just drawing pictures. He was doing science. He noted how air behaves like fluid, how wings must curve to create lift, and how drag slows flight. In the Codex on the Flight of Birds, he even speculated that humans might one day build gliders to imitate birds. His insights foreshadowed the principles of aerodynamics that wouldn't be formally described until centuries later. Now, put yourself in the shoes of someone back in the 1500s. This was a world still dominated by alchemy, astrology, and superstition. Then imagine cracking open one of Leonardo's notebooks and finding a diagram of a human strapped into giant wings, complete with equations and measurements. To most people of the Renaissance, it would have looked like straight sorcery. But Leonardo treated it as engineering. And while his sketches never left the page, that wasn't the point. His legacy is proof that aviation didn't begin as engineering, it began as imagination. The machines may not have flown, but the questions he asked about lift, drag, thrust, and control were the first real steps towards human flight. And for a dream that big, sometimes the first step is all it takes. Fast forward 400 years, and the dream of flight was no longer trapped on the page. In Germany, an engineer named Otto Lilienthal became the first person to prove that humans could truly glide through the air. Like Leonardo, Lilienthal was obsessed with birds, storks in particular. He grew up in Enklem, a small town in Prussia, where he and his brother Gustav spent hours watching how storks spread their wings and caught the wind. Later, Otto would write,
"To design a flying machine is nothing. To build one is something. But to fly is everything."
That motto sums up his entire philosophy. Flight wasn't just about theory alone. It had to be experienced. By the 1880s, he was putting that philosophy into practice. Lilienthal designed and built gliders that mimicked the curved wings of birds. Wooden frames stretched with cotton fabric. He would strap them to his back, climb a hill outside Berlin, and sprint forward until the wind lifted him into the air. Instead of plummeting, he floated, sometimes covering distances of 250 meters, or about 820 feet. To people in the 1890s, it was proof that humanity's dream of flight wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was happening. And Lilienthal wasn't just a daredevil, he was an engineer. He meticulously documented his flights, testing dozens of wing shapes and angles of attack. In 1889, he published The Bird Flight as the Basis of Aviation. This book laid out his theory that the curved, cambered wings, that like of a stork, was essential for generating lift. He wrote, "The secret of flight lies in the curved surface." That insight would later become the cornerstone of modern aerodynamics. The Wright brothers would call this book their Bible. Newspapers across Europe ran stories about the Glider King. Photographs of him mid-glide were sold as postcards. Crowds gathered to watch his flights, marveling at the sight of a man hanging in the sky with nothing but fabric and wood. Lilienthal became Europe's first aviation celebrity, kind of like an Evel Knievel of the 19th century, but with a scientific edge. But for all the wonder, there was always danger. Lilienthal's gliders had no controls beyond shifting his body weight, and the slightest gust could spell disaster. On August 9, 1896, during a flight near Reno Hills, he stalled at about 50 feet of altitude. The glider pitched forward and Lilienthal plummeted to the ground. He broke his spine and passed away the next day. His final words spoken to his brother were, "Sacrifices must be made." Those words echoed throughout the aviation community. They weren't just a resignation to fate, they were a statement of purpose. Lilienthal believed his work, even if it cost him his life, would pave the way for others. And he was right. The Wright brothers devoured his data, studying his tables of lift coefficients and wing curves. Wilbur Wright later said, of all the men who attacked the flying problem in the 19th century, Otto Lilienthal was the most important. But his wings carried others further than he ever could. His flights were the bridge between imagination and engineering. In the end, his legacy wasn't measured in how far he flew, but in how far he inspired others to go. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States had its own contender in the race for the skies. Samuel Langley was no daredevil hurling himself off hillsides, but he was an astronomer, physicist, and the head of the Smithsonian Institution, one of the most prestigious scientific posts in America. To many, Langley wasn't just another tinkerer. He was the man who could finally deliver the miracle of flight. If anyone could solve this riddle, it was him. By the 1890s, Langley had already proven he was onto something. He built a series of unmanned steam-powered models, launching them over the Potomac River. In 1896, one of these models, the Aerodrome No. 5, flew nearly a mile. A mile. Witnesses like Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, were astonished. Bell later described it as one of the most remarkable flights of our time. Suddenly, the impossible seemed tantalizingly close. Newspapers hailed Langley's models as the future, and the US War Department awarded him $50,000, a staggering sum of money at the time, to build a full-size manned version. America had put its bets on Langley to get there first. A spindly framework of wood and metal with long wings stretched over fabric, powered by a custom-made gasoline engine designed by Langley's assistant, Charles Manley. The entire craft looked fragile, more like a giant dragonfly than a machine that could carry a man. But behind it was years of scientific work and the full weight of government expectation. By October 1903, the stage was set. Crowds gathered on the banks of the Potomac. Journalists sharpened their pencils. The aerodrome sat perched up on top of a houseboat launch platform, its wings shimmering in the autumn light. Charles Manley, brave or perhaps reckless, climbed into the tiny cockpit, little more than a metal frame and a seat. For a moment, it felt like history was about to be made. Langley gave the order. The catapult fired, hurling the aerodrome forward. For an instant, it seemed to have leaped into the air. But then, disaster. The wings buckled under the stress, the machine twisted violently, and the entire craft plunged nose first into the river. Manley barely escaped drowning, saved only by quick-thinking crew members. The public gasped and the press pounced on them. Headlines the next day mocked Langley mercilessly. The New York Times sneered that it might take 1 to 10 million years before man ever figured out how to fly. Cartoons depicted Langley as a fool, tossing taxpayer money into the Potomac. The humiliation was severe, but Langley wasn't finished. Stung but determined, he regrouped. The aerodrome was repaired, its frame reinforced. Another attempt was scheduled for December. Once again, the aerodrome was loaded onto the houseboat launch platform. Imagine the tension. Icy winds cutting across the river, a small crowd watching in hushed silence, everyone wondering if this is the time the fragile machine would hold. The catapult snapped, the aerodrome lurched forward, and then, heartbreakingly, it shattered before it even cleared the platform. Pieces splintered in the Potomac, scattering across the water. Langley was pulled from the wreck, shaken, but alive. The second crash was even worse than the first. It proved that the great aerodrome was fundamentally flawed. And the cruelest twist of them all, just 9 days later, the famous flight at Kitty Hawk took place. 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio had succeeded where the head of the Smithsonian had failed. Langley's years of efforts were instantly overshadowed. His name mocked as a man who fell into the river while others soared into history. But here's the thing, that failure wasn't completely meaningless. Langley's experiments revealed crucial lessons about propulsion, power-to-weight ratios, and structural integrity. His mistakes showed the brothers what not to do, while his successes with smaller models proved flight was possible. In a strange way, his crashes cleared the runway literally and figuratively for the Wright brothers. By the time Orville and Wilbur Wright rolled out their flyer onto the dunes of Kitty Hawk, they weren't entering a blank field. They were closing a chapter written by countless dreamers. Leonardo da Vinci showed humanity how to imagine wings. Otto Lilienthal proved people can glide and control their descent. Samuel Langley showed engines could power machines, even if his designs were flawed. The Wright brothers took those scattered lessons, combined them with their own ingenuity, and solved the problem of sustained, controlled, powered flight. But the story doesn't end at Kitty Hawk. If the Wright brothers marked the beginning of aviation as a science, another man made it a spectacle. And his flights, public, stylish, and impossible to ignore, would make the world fall in love with the idea of flight. Alberto Santos-Dumont was unlike any other aviation pioneer. A Brazilian living in Paris, he was equal parts inventor and showman. He wore tailored suits, wide-brimmed hats, and turned his flights into public events. Instead of hidden test flights, Santos-Dumont brought aviation to the streets. In the early 1900s, he built small personal airships powered by gasoline engines. He piloted them through the boulevards of Paris, floating past landmarks, weaving between rooftops, and sometimes tying his balloons outside a cafe where he grabbed lunch. Imagine sipping your coffee in the early 1900s and you see a guy in a blimp pull up to your cafe. In 1901, he became a sensation. A Parisian prize had been offered to anyone who could fly from the suburb of St. Cloud, circle the Eiffel Tower, and return in under 30 minutes. Crowds gathered and skeptics doubted, but Santos-Dumont did it, completing the loop in just under the deadline. The city erupted in celebration, and the newspapers around the world carried the story. But he wasn't done. In 1906, Santos-Dumont unveiled a heavier-than-air craft called the 14 bis. In front of journalists and judges, he managed a short powered flight of about 200 feet. This was the first undeniable proof that they had ever seen that airplanes could fly. Unlike the Wright brothers' quiet experiments, Santos-Dumont's success was public, witnessed by crowds, and impossible to dismiss. He didn't invent aviation, but he made it popular. He made it glamorous, exciting, and real for everyday people. Santos-Dumont showed that flight wasn't just a dream for scientists, it was an adventure for humanity. And that's the real story of aviation before the Wright brothers. It wasn't just one sudden breakthrough. It was a relay of dreams, failures, and risks stretching back centuries. The Wright brothers get most of the credit, and rightly so. But their success was a culmination of generations of dreamers pushing the boundaries. Every sketch, glide, crash, and spectacle brought humanity one step closer to the skies. Thank you for joining me into this journey into aviation's forgotten past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you truly enjoyed it. Until next time, stay curious.